So welcome everybody. I'm Roger Corbett and this is
Dobe Newton. We're from the Bushwackers and this is Stringy Bark, our irregular podcast.
That's right. Each week or whenever we do a podcast, we try to take one of our songs and go through this sort of Australian history aspects of it, how the song came to be, and all the ins and outs of the songs. Most of our songs have a really strong Australian history connection and story to them, so this is no exception. So today we're going to do a song called "The Ballad of 1891."
Which has a fascinating history. Well, historically and culturally, Rog.
Yes, well, that's right, yes.
So shall I start?
Well, I just want to say that before we start, the first time I heard this song, I was at some kind of concert when I was like a teenager, or I can't even remember the circumstances, but Leonard Teale was on stage and there was a big sort of choir of men standing behind him, and he sang this song, and that's the first time I'd ever heard it, and it was quite a moving piece. You know, remember Leonard Teale, some of you, from Homicide, and, you know, and he was a great sort of speaker, wasn't he? So, and it was like, "The price of wool was falling in 1891," and the men all sang behind him. It was quite a thing. So that's the first time I heard it as a kid, until obviously I joined the Bushwackers and we started singing it.
Yeah.
So,
And so, jumping about a bit, the words were written by an Australian poet called Helen Palmer in 1950, and they were put to music by
Doreen Bridges,
the first woman to ever be given a doctorate in music education in Australia, just incidentally.
right?
And she was a great friend of the trade union movement. So she was very interested in folk music and its preservation. And she wrote the music. And it's interesting you should have referenced the Leonard Teale story, because her intention was that it would always be presented as a choral piece.
Right, yes.
Right? Now, we came across the song, and I'm not entirely sure how we did, but anyway, we came across the song, and in 1981, we decided to feature it on our album called Faces in the Street. And the idea was that we would use our electric instruments and drums, but it would become a feature piece, as it has remained, to showcase our instrumentalists and their wonderful abilities. Now, when the album was released, not long afterwards, we got a furious email from Doreen Bridges saying how appalled she was at our interpretation of the song, and that we should be ashamed of ourselves.
Which we never were.
We didn't bother replying, but I think that in retrospect, she probably made more out of our version and our inclusion of her music in our best-selling songbooks than she ever made from any of the performances by the Victorian Trade Union Choir, who apparently to this day still perform that song in that stentorian Leonard Teale fashion.
Yeah. Curious enough, I was in a choir when I lived in the Blue Mountains, and Tom Bridges was a part of that choir, and his mother was Doreen Bridges.
Wow.
Yeah, so we had few little chats about it over the years, so it was interesting.
So was he still furious on his mother's behalf?
No. I think everybody's moved on, Dobe.
Well,
As you do.
all right. So back to the story. And that song has, we'll get to it in a little while, but there are a number of links to us, the present day Bushwackers,
Right, yeah.
specifically associated with that song. So let's go back to the story. So here we are, we're in Queensland, and it's 1981, and the price of wool, as the first line of the song says, is falling. So the squatters, the landowners, are very keen to try and reduce costs as much as possible. And what they had prior to 1981 was they had an agreement with the Amalgamated Shearers Union that they would pay X amount for the shearing of sheep.
This is
And
1891. I just
yeah.
correct you there. Yeah.
Oh, what did I say?
You said 1981.
Oh, 1981. Oh, right. Okay. And so one of the areas that they looked at was saving costs by cutting down on the money that they paid to shearers. And the way they were going to do that was to employ non-union labour who would basically work for less.
Right.
And of course, the union and the shearers in general were outraged by the idea. And they were helped by the Maritime Workers Union in Brisbane, who basically came out and said, we will not handle and export any wool that's been sheared by non-union labour.
Right. Okay.
And so there we were, there was the standoff. So on one side, there were the shearers saying, your sheep will be shorn by union labour. And on the other hand, we've got the squatters and the landowners saying, no, we will bring in free labour or scab labour, as the unionists referred to it, and we will cut our costs. So the confrontation was drawn. There were tens of thousands of shearers who basically set up camps around major towns in Queensland where the shearing was taking place. And on the other hand, the landowners who were in cahoots with the colonial government brought in troopers and the army to make sure that nothing happened, that the shearing by free labour wasn't disrupted.
So the shearers were basically setting up picket lines, effectively.
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. But the bad news for the shearers was that the summer, so this is January 1891, and the strike basically went from January through to May. And
nice cool time of year.
Yeah, it was a particularly bad season, drought-wise. And so the shearers held out for a long time. There were some instances of vandalism, some shed burning, nothing outrageously confrontational. But basically the shearers couldn't last because they were hungry. They ran out of food. And so basically the strike petered out, and 14 of the strike leaders were sent to trial in Rockhampton. They were charged with sedition, and they were sentenced to 3 years hard labour.
Wow.
So that was the background to the strike. Now, in the song, it references a man named Billy Lane. Now, William Lane was a Christian socialist, and he was a significant supporter of the shearers. He wrote articles in the Brisbane Worker, and he attended meetings where the Eureka flag was flown and the strike leaders wore blue sashes to commemorate what had happened at Eureka. And he was devastated when the strike failed. And so he came up with this idea that he and a number of his followers, supporters, they would find somewhere to create a utopian version of Australian society where everybody was equal, treated fairly, etc., etc. So he wrote to a number of world leaders, and he got a letter back from Paraguay. Now, I know, and people go, why in the world Paraguay? Well, one of the reasons was that Paraguay had just been involved in a devastating war with their neighbours Bolivia, and they had lost a huge number of young male population as casualties of war. So they were in a situation where single women outnumbered single men in Paraguay by about 10 to 1.
Right. Wow.
And so they needed to come up with a solution quickly to try and repopulate their country. So they got back to William Lane and said, all right, mate, we'll give you a whole bunch of land, and so you can come up and set your utopian version of New Australia in our country. So in 1893, 500 people, including the famous poet Dame Mary Gilmore, who'd also been a great supporter of the strike. So 500 of them got on a ship and they sailed to Paraguay. Now, when they got there, they found that the land that they'd been granted was unsuitable for agriculture. It was surrounded by forests which had roaming jaguars in them.
And boa constrictors and
yes,
anacondas.
And parasitic insects. So it was totally unsuitable. But the worst part was that William Lane, who, as I said before, was a committed Christian, decided that this new Australia should be alcohol-free, and that yes, I know, and that there would be no fraternising with the local female population. So the shearers, who made up many of those 500, they were dreadfully unhappy about both of those things. And the Paraguayans were really unhappy that there was going to be no fraternising, therefore the whole thing wasn't going to work.
Yes.
And it didn't work. So slowly but surely, a lot of the people deserted from the original New Australia colony. William Lane decided that he'd give it another crack, and he and about 60 people went off to a new colony called Cosme, and that failed too. So 1895, William Lane's the last one to come home, or the last one of the leaders to come home, and he goes back to New Zealand where he was born, and having tried to establish a utopian socialist
Christian, puritanical. Yes.
Yeah. He ended up working for a right-wing newspaper in New Zealand. I mean, terribly strange. But so that was a story of New Australia. And to this day, there are still descendants of those original settlers
Right.
in Paraguay and Argentina.
So there may have been a little bit of fraternizing
Oh,
despite
yeah.
William
No,
Lane.
absolutely. There certainly was. Um, so, leaping about again, in 1950, the words to the Ballad of 1891 and the music had been composed. There, at this time in Australia, there was a great resistance to the fact that Australian culture was being taken over by American culture. Huh.
Huh.
The more things
Really?
change. Yeah, exactly. And one of the areas that it was happening in really obviously was in Broadway musicals.
Ah,
Oklahoma, Rogers and Hammerstein,
yes.
all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So a bunch of people who were aligned with the union movement thought it was time that there was an Australian musical.
Right.
So, yeah, so they used some of the words of Henry Lawson and other prominent people and came up with a musical play called Reedy River.
Right.
And one of the songs and the setting for the play was the Great Shearers Strike of 1891. That was the background to the story.
Ah, okay. Right.
And so this play was premiered in Melbourne in 1953, and the reviews were modest, I think it's fair to say.
Modest to scathing.
Yeah, in fact, one of the people said that Rogers and Hammerstein could sleep easy in their beds. This wasn't meant to be a challenge. But it was seen by estimates at the time said 450,000 Australians in its first season, which is a pretty amazing number.
Yeah, they'd
And
be happy with that these days.
yeah, and it included a lot of the traditional shearing songs, mostly, that we've been performing for all these years. But it did include the Ballad of 1891. And in Melbourne, that music was performed by an orchestra who didn't get much of a rap. But when the Sydney season was to be delivered, they decided that rather than have an orchestra, they would actually assemble a group of musicians from the folk scene to supply the musical accompaniment.
Right.
And so they did, and that group was called the Bushwackers.
Ah, I
And,
see. Right, yeah.
and after the play had finished, they decided that they would continue to play together, and they made a couple of recordings for Wattle Records, which are the only remainders of their cultural input. But they inspired, because there had been very, very few Australian folk music recordings released before then, and most of them had been done by people from overseas.
Right. Burl Ives being one of them, I think.
Earl Ives being a prominent example,
Mm.
um, and folklorists from England
Oh,
who
yeah.
had basically collected a lot of these songs. So
So
having an
was
Australian
John
group,
Meredith in that band, in the
yes,
Bushwackers?
indeed,
All right.
indeed,
He was the famous collector, wasn't
he sure was.
he? Mm.
And he was the one who ultimately led to the demise of that band, because he'd come from a very strict folk purist background.
Mm.
And his thing was that if you sang a traditional song, it had to be sung in unison.
Right. Mm.
No harmonies, none of that fancy shit. So he was the director, the musical director, and there were other people in the band who were not at all happy with that approach. They
Right.
wanted to
Yeah.
explore the boundaries.
Mm.
And so he just said, no, my way or the highway. And so that was the end of the Bushwackers, really. Couple
Wow.
of couple of years, couple of recordings, but it inspired a lot of people to understand that there were traditional Australian songs, and even though they were borrowed
Yeah.
from
Sure.
Anglo-Celtic tradition, they'd been interpreted in a unique and relevant and identifiable way. And so, although the Bushwackers soon disappeared, the music certainly didn't. And it did go on to include harmonies and arrangements and
Sure. Mm.
all those sorts of things.
Well,
Much,
interestingly, Dope, we were at Port Fairy a few years ago at the festival, and which we're apparently going to do again in 2027. And I went to, and I think you were probably there too. It was a tribute to John Meredith. Interestingly, there was some footage of the original Bushwhackers who were leaping about and playing the traditional instruments and doing all that sort of stuff. And they were very like it wasn't, a very kind of stiff, folky thing. It was very lively and reminiscent of this Bushwhackers in many
yeah,
ways.
yeah, yeah.
It wasn't a stiff performance at all. So
Oh
I was
no,
kind
and
of
and
interested
they
about that. Yeah,
and they got followed by um, the Colonials
yeah,
and Wild Colonial Boys, who were exactly the same.
yeah,
So it was rough and ready, energetic,
yeah.
and different.
Cobbers too, I guess, and
Yep.
of course, us as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, well, that's all very interesting, Dobe. That's fascinating.
Well, let's hope so.
All right. Well, we might leave 1891 right there. It's a great piece. We love performing at 1891 because, as you say, it features usually our fiddle player and guitar players, and it's been kind of a big sort of performance piece for us for so long,
Yeah.
and that the words of that song, which is like 400 verses, are locked in your long distance memory. So
Yeah.
that's
And
it's
look, I
good.
suppose the last thing to say is that even though the strike was broken and the leaders were imprisoned and New Australia failed, what that strike showed was that there was a need for a much more centralised organisation to represent working people.
Mm,
And if it hadn't been for that strike, then a couple of years later, we wouldn't have had the proclamation of the Queensland Labor movement,
right.
which
Yeah.
was the foundation for the Australian Labor Party. When the proclamation was read under the Tree of Knowledge in Barcaldine, which was central to the theatre where the
Right. Yeah.
1891 strike took place. So the song lives on
Yep.
in any number of cultural and
Yeah.
political debates. Yeah.
Because at that time there was probably a worldwide union kind of push on anyway, wasn't it? In America, all that Joe Hill stuff
Yeah.
and all those things. And there's many, and they have their own tradition of the unions, and lots of violence over in America, of course, and
Yeah.
all
And
around the
and
world, I guess. Yeah.
and it hadn't been long before that Australia was the first country in the world to enact the 8-hour working day.
Right. Oh, okay.
And to this day, there is still a monument outside Trades Hall in Melbourne celebrating the fact that we were the first.
Wow. There you go. Well, good old Australia then. That's
Good old Australia.
And good on the shearers who were part of the 1891 uprising. And as you often say, it came close to a civil war. I guess if they'd opened fire and stuff like that, it would have been a different story.
I mean, if they hadn't run out of food,
Mm.
who knows what would have happened.
Yeah. Okay. That's all very interesting, Dobe. Fantastic. Okay. Well, thanks for listening to Stringy Bark. We'll be back with some more Stringy Bark episodes really soon. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.